Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a text that has, well, shaped cultures and beliefs for millennia. The Bible itself.
Hmm.
We're not just skimming the surface here. We're plunging into the complex, often surprising story of how it actually came to be, who put it together, when, where, why, and critically, how it's been interpreted and, used throughout history.
We're doing this based on the sources you shared with us, basically,
Yeah.
pulling key insights from a really deep conversation with an expert on biblical scholarship.
Exactly. Think of this as our mission briefing, right?
Right.
Extract the most important nuggets, the surprising facts, the perspectives that might just challenge some assumptions you didn't even realize you had.
Yeah, the goal is for you to walk away feeling more informed about this incredibly important book.
Definitely. We're going to cover some big foundational questions about authorship, historicity, the very nature of these texts, including some topics that, well, they often spark quite a bit of debate.
For sure.
So let's jump right in by looking at how people typically approach the Bible. There's a widespread traditional view, you find it in many Christian traditions, that sees the Bible as inherent, infallible, containing everything needed for salvation, and directly inspired by God.
Right. They often point to 2 Timothy 3.16 and that Greek word, theopneustos.
It breathed.
Exactly, God breathed. That's the cornerstone for that view.
But then you have other approaches, like maybe the Latter-day Saint perspective, which theoretically allows for the idea that the text might have been altered or changed somewhere along the line, in transmission or translation.
That's right. Their article of faith about believing the Bible as far as it is translated correctly is often kind of broadened to mean transmitted and preserved correctly.
Hmm.
So theoretically, there's an openness there. The text isn't necessarily seen as absolutely inherent or infallible in every single detail.
Okay, but here's where the sources point out something really interesting. Even within traditions that are theoretically open to change or alteration, like you just described,
All right.
many people still end up treating the Bible, or at least their preferred interpretation of it, as, well, de facto inherent.
That's a key point.
They rely so heavily on traditional interpretations or specific footnotes, maybe like Joseph Smith translation variants in the LDS context, that they treat those versions or interpretations as the fixed, unchangeable truth.
And the sources suggest that both this really rigid adherence to explicit inerrancy and this de facto treatment of certain interpretations as inherent, well, both can be problematic when you try to engage honestly with the text itself and the actual data surrounding it.
Okay, let's talk about that data. What about things like the literalness of the stories, their historicity, and who actually wrote them? I think the common picture for many, particularly in English-speaking U.S. Christianity, and often within traditions like the LDS Church, is pretty straightforward,
Yeah.
right?
What's that common picture?
Well, that the books were written by the people whose names are attached to them. Matthew wrote Matthew, Moses wrote the entire Pentateuch. And that the historical events described happened literally, exactly as written.
Yes, that's a very common perception, probably held by the vast majority of Christians, especially in the U.S. And often, the more deeply committed someone is to the Bible, the more likely they are to hold that view of, singular authorship and literal historicity.
And the expert in these sources makes it clear their goal isn't to dismantle anyone's faith, but rather to present the academic context and the data that might challenge these prevailing views.
Exactly. The hope is that a more informed perspective can actually lead to a richer understanding. It's about sharing the knowledge from academic study, not tearing down belief.
But maybe offering a foundation for faith that's more robust, able to engage with the complexities of the text.
Precisely. That's the idea.
Okay, let's dive into the who. Who is actually responsible for writing the Bible? Because it sounds like it's way more complicated than just Moses and Matthew.
Oh, it is. That traditional idea of maybe 40 or 45 authors working over a long period, the data suggests it's not that simple at all. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of people being responsible for this collection of texts over time.
Hundreds. Wait, not just the famous names? How do we even get to that number?
It's because of how the texts were composed.
Yeah.
Think of it as a long, layered process, like sediment building up over time.
Okay.
The very earliest parts, maybe short poetic fragments, likely date back to the late 2nd millennium BCE, say 1200 to 1000 BCE. These were short, easy to remember, good for oral transmission.
Right, easier to pass down by word of mouth.
Exactly. Over centuries, these fragments were embedded into larger poetic stories. Then, those stories were woven into larger historical narratives. You've got multiple layers of writing, editing, re-editing happening over hundreds of years, by many different hands.
So it didn't start with someone like Moses sitting down and writing out, say, Genesis and Exodus cover to cover.
That's the key insight, the idea that text is the primary or even the best way to transmit tradition. That's actually a relatively later concept in history.
Ah, okay. So before widespread writing, it was mainly oral.
In the earliest periods, oral tradition was absolutely central. And when stories are passed down orally, they get adapted, right? They get massaged, depending on who's telling them, who they're telling them to, what point they're trying to make.
Like how I might tell the story of meeting my partner differently at a dinner party versus telling it to my kids.
Exactly. Perfect analogy. You shape it for the audience and the purpose.
Yeah.
So when these stories were eventually written down, they reflected the context and the circumstances of that specific time period and the goals of the people doing the writing.
And this process helps explain something fascinating, why you find conflicting viewpoints within the same book. Like you mentioned, parts of Samuel seem opposed to having a king, while other parts are clearly advocating for a monarchy.
Precisely. They likely represent different layers added by authors addressing different situations, maybe centuries apart.
Wow. That must make figuring out the who wrote what and when an incredibly complex task for scholars.
It really does. It's very, very difficult to neatly disentangle all these literary layers. We can see patterns, make educated guesses based on language, style, theology.
Okay.
For instance, many of the narratives in the Pentateuch and the historical books seem to originate in the 8th or 7th centuries BCE, some even later, and the final compilation happened much later still. Isaiah, too, is widely recognized by scholars as containing material from multiple different time periods added by different authors or schools.
Right. Sometimes called 1st, 2nd, 3rd Isaiah.
Exactly. Different voices, different contexts.
Okay, let's shift to the New Testament then. The traditional picture is Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, John wrote John. What does the data say about that?
Well, the data indicates that the Gospels circulated anonymously for quite a long time, maybe about a century after the events they describe, before those traditional names Matthew, Mark, Luke, John were assigned.
Anonymous for 100 years. Really? Then how did they get those names attached?
It seems the assignments are based more on tradition and, frankly, theological interests, rather than direct historical evidence from the time.
What kind of interests?
Well, early Christian leaders likely wanted to connect these important Gospels to key figures in early Christianity. The foremost prominent disciples were arguably Peter, James, John, and Paul.
Okay.
James died too early to have a gospel really attributed to him in the same way. Peter already had Mark associated with him traditionally as his interpreter. John, the beloved disciple, gets a gospel. Luke is linked to Paul as his companion.
And Matthew.
Matthew's gospel mentions a tax collector named Matthew being called by Jesus. So it's a convenient fit, perhaps taking the place James might have occupied in that core group. It gives the gospel apostolic authority.
So it was more about establishing authority and connection to the apostles rather than a direct eyewitness account being written down by that specific apostle.
That's what the evidence points towards, yeah. The Gospels themselves don't actually claim authorship internally. They don't say, I, Matthew, wrote this.
Huh. I never really thought about that.
And scholarly analysis reveals indications of later changes or alterations within the Gospels themselves, like places where a discourse seems interrupted or geographical details don't quite line up perfectly, suggesting editing or compilation over time.
Okay. What about Paul? Did he write all the letters attributed to him in the New Testament?
Based on the data, looking at writing style, vocabulary, theology, historical context, Paul almost certainly did not write the pastoral epistles.
That's 1 Angelica, Timothy, and Titus.
Correct. Those were likely written decades after his death, maybe early 2nd century. Hebrews, definitely not Paul. And probably not 2 Thessalonians or Ephesians either, though there's more debate there.
And Revelation, John the Revelator.
The author of Revelation, who calls himself John, is stylistically and theologically quite distinct from the author of the Gospel of John. The Greek writing styles are vastly different. Most scholars see them as 2 different Johns.
And this is where that term pseudepigrapha comes in, right? What does that mean exactly, and is it relevant here?
Pseudepigrapha literally means false writing, or falsely attributed.
Okay.
It refers to texts attributed to a famous person they didn't actually write.
Okay.
Academically, texts like the pastoral epistles could be considered pseudepigraphal because they are attributed to Paul but likely weren't written by him. Now, the term can be controversial because false sounds like not legitimate, and the pastorals are part of the New Testament canon for most Christians.
Right, it sounds negative.
It can. But understanding that some books were attributed to apostles after their lifetime helps us understand the history of how the canon formed and how authority was established in the early church. It was a common practice in the ancient world, actually.
And the Gospels, are they pseudepigrapha?
Interestingly, not technically, because as we noted, they didn't claim authorship in the first place in their original form. The names were added later by tradition, so they weren't falsely attributed by the text itself.
Got it. Okay, so the Who isn't a small group of famous individuals writing everything down perfectly. It's a massive, complex, centuries-long process involving hundreds of people, layers of oral and written tradition, later attributions, especially in the New Testament.
Exactly. It's a much more dynamic and, frankly, human picture.
Okay, let's move on to the genre. What kind of books are actually in the Bible? Because the sources suggest they weren't always intended to be read primarily as, like, literal history books.
That's a crucial point. While some texts, the historical books like Kings or Chronicles, do aim to recount a particular history, though often with a specific viewpoint or agenda,
Right.
many others function very differently. A lot of them are what scholars call charter myths or foundation myths.
Okay, what are those?
They are origin stories for a people. They're designed to explain where they came from, who they are, and often, really importantly, to justify their identity or their claim to land. They also embed ideologies, explanations for why things are the way they are.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Take Genesis 3.16, about the woman's pain in childbirth and her desire for her husband who will rule over her. It's often read by scholars as an ideology, an explanation written back into the origin story to justify the patriarchal structure of the society at the time it was written.
So they're like origin stories and foundational justifications. Maybe less like a modern history textbook and more like, well, almost like Aesop's fables in a way, in that they convey meaning or justify existing circumstances.
In some ways, yes, that comparison works for certain parts. The primeval history in Genesis 1:11, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah's flood, Tower of Babel, and the stories of the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These seem to function more like legends or myths, serving those ideological and foundational purposes.
And figures like Job.
Job, too, was likely understood more as a once-upon-a-time kind of story. It's wrestling with profound philosophical problems, like the problem of evil and suffering, in a way that transcends a strict historical setting. It's wisdom literature in narrative form.
What about the prophetic books? They seem different.
They are, and they represent an evolution. Ancient prophecy, in the wider ancient Near East, often involved trying to discern strategic information through divination, looking at bird flights, examining animal livers, drawing lots, stuff like that.
Sounds a bit like folk magic.
It has parallels, yeah.
Yeah.
Think about the Urim and Thummim mentioned in some biblical stories, perhaps reflecting that earlier stage, compared to later accounts focusing just on a prophet receiving a direct divine message.
So how did biblical prophecy change?
It shifted focus towards the prophet delivering a message, often a challenging one, aimed at the social or political order, usually based on ethical grounds tied to the covenant with God. Sometimes they worked for the king, sometimes they spoke out against him.
And it sounds like authors were even willing to reinterpret or, well, argue with earlier texts to serve their own goals.
Absolutely. This is a fascinating insight from the source material. There's a really problematic passage in Exodus 22.29, that sounds very much like God commanding the sacrifice of firstborn children. Yeah. Later authors clearly struggled with this. Jeremiah, for instance, writing centuries later, tries to kind of bury it. He essentially has God came, he never gave such commands.
Okay, so he denies it.
But Ezekiel, grappling with the same difficult passage around the same time as Jeremiah, interprets it in a shockingly different way. He has God say he did give laws that were not good, seemingly referring back to that child sacrifice command in order to desolate the people as punishment.
Wait, Ezekiel says God gave bad laws on purpose, including child sacrifice.
That's how his argument in Ezekiel 20 reads, yes. It shows later authors weren't just passively copying scripture, they were actively wrestling with and reinterpreting earlier traditions, sometimes in radically different ways, to fit their own theological framework and historical context.
Wow, so authors were literally contradicting previous scripture to make their point. That's a powerful realization.
It is. It highlights the dynamic nature of the tradition.
So understanding the genre that these texts are myths, ideologies, selective histories, challenging reinterpretations, philosophical tales, it sounds like, that frees you up to engage with the Bible on a much deeper level than just trying to read it as a single literal historical account.
Exactly.
It helps, for instance, when wrestling with really challenging passages like those involving violence or difficult social dynamics or these kinds of internal contradictions.
It absolutely does. It gives you tools to understand why the text might be saying certain things in certain ways, and to wrestle with the contradictions and the ethical challenges, rather than being forced to either accept everything as a flat, literal command or historical fact, or just reject it all outright.
Okay. Let's connect this back to the when more directly, especially for those really early figures, Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, the patriarchs, the 12 tribes. For someone whose faith tradition might place a lot of emphasis on the literalness of these figures and events.
Like the LDS tradition, for example, with Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham through the book of Abraham, the 12 tribes idea underpinning patriarchal blessings, even the Tower of Babel connection to the Book of Mormon.
Right. For someone in that position, what does the available data say about the actual historicity of these foundational figures and events?
Well, based on the available data, archaeological, textual, linguistic figures like Adam, Eve, Noah, the patriarchs, and that whole primeval history in Genesis 1:11, they seem to function much more like legends or myths.
Serving those foundational and ideological purposes you mentioned, like explaining identity or justifying land claims?
Exactly. The data simply doesn't strongly support their literal historicity in the way they are often presented in tradition.
And what kind of data leads scholars to that conclusion?
Well, for one, the sheer antiquity of those timelines. We're talking about periods thousands of years before the development of a written Hebrew language, which scholars generally place around 1000 BCE, give or take.
So no written records from that time, in Hebrew at least.
Correct. There are also clear instances of borrowing from much earlier traditions. The flood story, for example, has clear, much older parallels in Sumerian and Akkadian literature, like the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Right, Utnapishtim.
Exactly. The Tower of Babel story also seems to draw on knowledge of Mesopotamian ziggurats from a later period.
Is there any external data that connects to the early biblical narrative?
There is some. The Merneptah stele, an Egyptian inscription from around 1208 BCE, is very significant because it mentions a group called Israel existing in Canaan around that time.
Okay, so that confirms Israel was a known entity then.
Yes, which is earlier than widespread written Hebrew, interestingly. But it doesn't confirm the specific biblical narrative about their origins, the Exodus, the conquest, or the stories of the patriarchs. It just confirms the people called Israel were there.
So, for someone whose tradition is built on the absolute literalness of these early figures and events, what you're saying is the academic data, the evidence we have, just doesn't support that view. It makes it unlikely to be historically accurate in the way tradition often portrays it.
That's correct. While historical reconstructions are always open to refinement as new data emerges, the probability that the entire traditional narrative, from Adam and Eve through the patriarchs, is literally, factually, historically accurate. Well, based on the available data, that probability is incredibly low.
And defaulting to that literal assumption.
It becomes a position that's very difficult to defend based on evidence.
Yeah.
And this tension between tradition and data is often a point of significant challenge, sometimes even crisis, for people's faith.
Understood. Okay, let's pivot to the where and why. The where is about context. Why is it so vital to remember the Bible is a foreign text?
Because we're reading texts from ancient Southwest Asia, written thousands of years ago. They reflect worldviews that are vastly different from our typical 21st century Western perspective. Well, they often come from cultures focused on communalism rather than individualism, on honor and shame dynamics rather than guilt and innocence frameworks. When we read the Bible through our modern cultural lens, we unintentionally import our own assumptions, our own values, which can significantly distort what the original authors were trying to communicate in their world.
So recognizing this foreignness, this cultural distance, is crucial.
It's the first step, really. Approaching it with the caution and humility needed to understand it better, rather than just assuming it thinks like we do.
And the why, the rhetorical function, the purpose.
Yeah.
Why were these texts written according to the sources?
Many were written with very specific goals in mind. Often those goals involved structuring power, establishing authority, or promoting particular values and identities for a specific group.
Okay, power and authority, how does that play out?
Look at the historical books like Samuel, Kings, and then Chronicles, which retells much of the same history. They cover overlapping periods, but with significant differences in emphasis and detail.
Right, Chronicles seems much more focused on the temple and the priests.
Exactly. Many of those differences, the sources suggest, are directly related to advocating for increased power and authority for specific groups. particularly the Levitical priests in the case of Chronicles, writing after the exile.
So some of the biblical writings are, in part, arguments for who should be in charge, which version of history supports their claim.
A lot of them can be read that way, yes. Consider the famous story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel.
Yeah, the fire from heaven showdown.
It's often read as a simple good versus evil narrative, right? Monotheism versus paganism. But it also reflects a power struggle between competing priestly groups within ancient Israelite society. And later edits to these kinds of stories might even add figures, like the goddess Asherah being defeated alongside Baal, further demonizing earlier, perhaps more common, religious practices to consolidate a particular monotheistic identity and justify a specific group's power structure, essentially saying, these other ways were bad, our way is the only right way, and therefore we should be in charge.
This idea of creating boundaries and elevating one group over others sounds like something the expert calls schismogenesis.
Yes, exactly. Schismogenesis, the introduction or exaggeration of difference. Biblical authors frequently engaged in this process to curate their identity and distinguish themselves sharply from others they perceived as pagan or wicked or just not us. It was a fundamental way of defining us versus them.
And this process, while maybe necessary for forming an identity, sounds like it also embedded some ideas that feel uncomfortable to us today, like strains of ethnocentrism or ideas that seem elitist.
It did. While you certainly see powerful countercurrents, like Paul's radical vision in Galatians of neither male nor female, Jew nor Gentile in Christ,
Right.
those kinds of distinctions were often reinforced in other places, maybe in Acts, which seems to narrow the qualifications for apostleship back down to specific Jewish men who were with Jesus from the beginning. This points to a real challenge that the source is called the tyranny of heritage.
The tyranny of heritage.
Yeah, the difficulty of letting go of aspects inherited from the past simply because they are tradition, even when those aspects reflect elitist, exclusionary, or ethically problematic ideas from that ancient context.
So how does acknowledging this context and purpose, the ancient culture, the power dynamics, the identity curation, the schismogenesis, how does that change how we read those difficult passages, say involving violence or judgment or exclusivity?
It allows us to see those passages not just as timeless, abstract divine commands dropped from heaven, but as products of specific historical and cultural contexts. They reflect the struggles, the perspectives, sometimes the biases of the actual human beings who wrote them down.
So it helps us contextualize, maybe even critique.
It helps us recognize that some of what we've inherited through tradition, while deeply rooted, might be ethically problematic from our perspective today. And that letting go of those interpretations or ideas, even when it challenges long-held tradition, can be necessary for a healthier, more ethical understanding and application of the texts now.
Okay. Finally, the how did this collection of texts actually come together to form what we call the Bible? Canonization, right? And how has it been transmitted and translated? First off, let's clear this up. Is Dan Brown right about the Council of Nicaea determining the canon in 325 CE?
Absolutely not. That is a complete myth, popularized by fiction, but it has zero basis in historical fact.
Okay, good to know.
The Council of Nicaea was about major theological debates, primarily the nature of Jesus Christ in relation to God the Father. It had nothing, literally nothing, to do with deciding which books belonged in the Bible.
So how did the canon happen then, if not a big meeting?
It was a much slower, more organic process. Think of it like a gradual crystallization over centuries. It really started taking shape well after Nicaea, primarily from the 4th century CE onwards, and even then it varied in different parts of the Christian world.
So not a single council making a definitive list.
No. It was more about different congregations and communities slowly coming to a consensus over a long time about which texts they used regularly in worship and considered authoritative for faith and practice. It was usage that largely determined canonicity.
Were there texts that were considered authoritative for a while but didn't make the final cut?
Oh, absolutely. Texts that were considered authoritative for generations, even quoted or alluded to in the New Testament itself, like the Book of Enoch, were eventually left out of the final collection for most Christian traditions. The Shepherd of Hermas was another popular one.
What about the Apocrypha, books like 1 and 2 Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon?
Those texts were definitely part of authoritative collections for many early Christians and are still in the Catholic and Orthodox canons. They contain really interesting ideas and historical information. For example, 1 Maccabees gives history of the Maccabean revolt, and 2 Maccabees mentions prayers or even sacrifices being offered for the dead soldiers.
Interesting. That offers insights into early religious practices, maybe predating later traditions like Mormon proxy ordinances, showing similar ideas were circulating.
Exactly. It shows a broader, more diverse landscape of religious thought and practice in that period that we sometimes assume based only on the Protestant canon.
Okay, let's talk about translation, specifically the King James Version, KJV. Many traditions, particularly historically within the LDS Church, have treated it as the most accurate or even uniquely inspired translation. What does the data say?
Well, the data challenges that notion pretty strongly. Modern translations, the good scholarly ones anyway, are generally based on older, more complete, and more reliable Greek and Hebrew manuscripts than the ones available to the King James translators back in the early 17th century.
We've found better source texts since 1611.
Significantly better, yes. Major manuscript discoveries happened in the 19th and 20th centuries. Plus, our understanding of the original Hebrew and Greek languages, how they work, their vocabulary, their nuances, has also improved dramatically over 4 centuries of scholarship.
So modern translations are often clearer and more accurate.
Generally speaking, yes. They're often much clearer in conveying what the original authors likely meant, and frankly, they're usually easier for modern readers to understand than the archaic language of the KJV.
So if modern translations are often better based on the evidence, why is the KJV sometimes still prioritized institutionally, like in the LDS tradition?
It often comes back to that tyranny of tradition idea we mentioned. For some groups, like the LDS Church historically, prioritizing the KJV helped set them apart from mainline Protestantism, which was moving towards newer versions in the 20th century. It became a marker of identity.
Ah,
Later, the argument sort of shifted. The fact that the KJV's distinctive language appear in the Book of Mormon or the Joseph Smith translation was used as evidence for the KJV's inspiration, effectively aligning their textual preferences with a kind of traditional evangelical conservatism.
but you're saying this emphasis on the KJV as the standard is relatively recent.
In the LDS context, yes. The strong institutional emphasis, making it almost the required standard, really solidified more in the mid to late 20th century. Earlier leaders used various translations.
Okay, this brings up a specific point from the sources that directly challenges Book of Mormon historicity based on what we know about ancient text transmission. The idea that a figure named Laban in Jerusalem around 600 BCE would possess brass plates containing Old Testament texts. How does that stack up against the data?
That specific detail is quite difficult to reconcile with the available archaeological and textual data from that period.
Why? What are the issues?
Several things. First, using brass plates for extensive writing like that would likely imply a codex format like pages of a book. That format didn't become common for sacred texts in Judaism until centuries later, probably influenced by Christian practices around the 1st or 2nd century CE. Before that, scrolls were the norm for scriptures.
Okay, format is one issue. What else?
The material itself. While metal plates did exist in the ancient Near East, they were typically very rare, expensive, prestige items used for short inscriptions, treaties, or dedications, not usually for keeping comprehensive records like an entire collection of scriptures. Papyrus or leather scrolls were the standard.
And what about access to the texts themselves?
That's maybe the biggest hurdle. If someone did have access to all those Old Testament texts, or what existed of them, in Jerusalem around 600 BCE, they would almost certainly exist as a collection of scrolls. Access to such extensive sacred texts would have been extremely limited, likely restricted to the temple institutions or very high-level scribal elites associated with the royal court, not something a private citizen like Laban, even if wealthy, would likely possess.
So the description of Laban having brass plates containing the Old Testament texts just doesn't align with what we know about writing materials, formats, or text distribution and accessibility in Jerusalem at that specific time.
Based on the current archaeological and textual evidence, no, it doesn't align well at all. It presents significant historical anomalies.
Okay, that's a very specific challenge based on the data. We've covered the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Let's transition now, as promised, to some of those specific hot-button issues often debated using the Bible.
Absolutely. Where should we start? Homosexuality is often a major one.
Let's start there. The common perception, particularly in conservative religious circles, is that the Bible universally and clearly forbids homosexual behavior and, by extension, orientation.
Right. That's a very prevalent interpretation. But the data from actually studying the texts themselves in their original languages and contexts complicates that picture considerably.
How so?
First, the Bible doesn't really address homosexuality as a sexual orientation in the way we understand that concept today. That's a modern framework. When it touches on the topic, it's prohibiting specific acts, often within very specific cultural and historical contexts.
What kind of context are we talking about?
Well, in the Old Testament, the main passages are in Leviticus. These are part of the Holiness Code, the cultic purity laws for ancient Israel.
Right, things about diet, clothing, ritual purity.
Exactly. They were designed primarily to set that specific people, Israel, apart from the surrounding nations, establishing their unique covenant relationship with God through distinctive ritual and behavior. They weren't necessarily intended as universal, timeless moral condemnations for all people for all time.
Okay, what about the New Testament passages? Romans, Corinthians.
Those passages often mention unnatural acts, frequently linked directly to idolatry, abandoning worship of the Creator for worship of creation. The key Greek terms used, malakoi and arsenokoitai, are actually quite difficult to translate definitively and are heavily debated by scholars.
What might they mean?
Malakoi might refer to effeminacy or perhaps the passive partner in male prostitution. Arsenokoitai is a term Paul seems to have possibly coined, combining male and bed. Its precise meaning is unclear, but based on how similar terms were used, it likely referred to specific forms of exploitative sexual acts, like male prostitution, pederasty, sex with boys, or perhaps sexual violence, rather than encompassing all forms of consensual same-sex relationships as we might understand them today.
So, these few passages, often taken out of their original context, don't actually provide a clear, universal, biblical condemnation of all consensual same-sex activity or orientation.
That's what the bulk of critical academic data suggests, yes. Furthermore, if you're going to appeal to the Old Testament Levitical laws against specific sexual acts, consistency seems to demand you uphold all those laws, including the ones about food, clothing, agriculture, mixing fabrics, and even prescribing death penalties for various offenses like adultery or disrespecting parents, which, of course, most Christians don't do.
Right, people are inherently selective.
They are inherently selective about which laws from the Old Testament they feel still apply today, even though the Bible itself doesn't provide a straightforward, unambiguous guide for how to make that selection.
And what about Sodom and Gomorrah? That story is almost always brought up in this context.
Sodom and Gomorrah, when you read it carefully in its full biblical context, especially alongside a very similar and disturbing story in Judges 19, it seems fundamentally about attempted gang rape, brutal violence, and a profound failure of hospitality, violating sacred duties towards guests.
Not about consensual relationships.
No. The demand for the men of Sodom was to sexually assault Lot's angelic guests as a way of shaming, demeaning, and dominating them. Attributing the city's destruction solely to homosexuality requires ignoring the text's emphasis on violence, pride, and inhospitality, which other parts of the Bible, like Ezekiel, explicitly highlight as Sodom's sin.
So using these few context-specific and often debated passages to condemn all consensual same-sex relationships or orientation, as is often done, it really requires ignoring the historical context, the original purpose, the intended audience, and the linguistic nuances of the texts.
It appears so, based on scholarly analysis. And unfortunately, interpreting these texts in that way has caused immense harm and contributed to many people feeling excluded, judged, or even leaving their faith traditions entirely.
It's also interesting, as noted in the sources, that specific restoration scripture, like the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, are actually largely silent on the topic of same-sex sexuality. And it's apparently hard to find explicit quotes from Joseph Smith condemning it either.
That silence, particularly in texts presented as being specifically for our day, does complicate the argument that opposition to same-sex relationships is some kind of timeless, universal, divine mandate that has existed clearly from the beginning of time.
It raises questions, right? Why wasn't it considered a significant enough issue to address directly in those later texts, if it was indeed such a fundamental, universal sin?
Exactly. It suggests that much of the modern anti-LGBTQ rhetoric found in some religious traditions appears to parallel broader cultural and political movements, especially from the mid-20th century onwards, more than it uniquely stems from distinct, unambiguous, universally applicable scriptural commands found across all canonical texts.
Okay, let's move to another area where traditional views are often challenged by a closer look at the texts. Women in the Bible. The sources state clearly that the texts seem to reflect a deeply patriarchal society.
They absolutely do. There's no real way around that. Biblical texts reflect societies, ancient Israelite, early Jewish, Greco-Roman, where women were generally valued less than men in the public sphere and were often treated legally and socially more like property than independent persons.
Can you give an example?
You see it in various laws and narratives.
Hmm.
For instance, in Exodus 21, there are regulations about selling daughters into debt slavery, which likely included sex slavery. While there are rules, those rules still underscore her subordinate status compared to a male slave in similar circumstances. Inheritance laws favored sons, women's testimony was often valued less, their lives revolved around the male figure's fathers, husbands, sons.
But are there nuances? Are there stories where women navigate or maybe even subtly subvert this patriarchal system?
Yes, definitely. And those are some of the most fascinating parts of the text. Think about the story of Tamar in Genesis 38.
Right, Judah's daughter-in-law.
Yes. She resorts to deception and what appears to be sex work to trick her father-in-law into fulfilling his levirate duty to provide her with an heir after her husband's died. It's shocking stuff. And yet, the text ends up portraying her as more righteous than Judah, the powerful patriarch who failed in his obligations.
So it shows women using the limited means available to them.
Exactly. Or think of Esther, a queen in a foreign patriarchal empire. She uses her intelligence, courage, and position to save her people, operating effectively within that system without ever directly challenging the system itself. These stories show authors grappling with complex realities, sometimes celebrating women who found ways to achieve important ends despite the severe constraints of their society.
So the common assumption maybe that the Old Testament embodies modern idealized family values or gender roles is really challenged by these texts. They don't present a blueprint for equality as we'd see it.
Not at all. The texts reflect the social framework they were written in a patriarchal system where women's status was lower. While authors might celebrate specific women who navigated this system cleverly or righteously, they didn't fundamentally critique or dismantle the system itself.
What about the New Testament? Is it different?
It's complex. You have Paul's radical statement in Galatians 3:28, neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That sounds incredibly egalitarian.
It does.
But then you have other passages, particularly in letters attributed to Paul but likely written later, like 1 Timothy or parts of 1 Corinthians, that seem to reinforce very traditional subservient roles for women demanding silence in church, submission to husbands. These possibly reflect the later adoption of standard Greco-Roman household norms into certain Christian communities as the church became more established.
So tensions within the New Testament itself.
Definitely. And alongside those restrictive passages, you also have historical evidence for women holding significant leadership roles in the very early church, like Junia, whom Paul himself calls an apostle in Romans 16, or Phoebe the deacon. So it's a mixed picture.
What about biblical polygamy? That's a topic that comes up, especially in discussions of restoration movements that practiced it. Was it commanded? Condoned?
Polygamy, or more accurately polygyny, one man, multiple wives, was clearly a societal norm, especially for wealthy and powerful men throughout much of the Old Testament period. Kings like David and Solomon had many wives and concubines. The texts regulated, for instance, laws about inheritance among sons of different wives, but they don't prohibit it for men.
So it wasn't a divine command that needed to be restored later.
There's nothing in the Old Testament text that suggests it was a positive divine command for all time, or something God particularly wanted people to do. It was simply part of the social fabric of that time and place, much like, frankly, slavery was regulated but not prohibited. Expecting God to command polygamy back then would be a bit like expecting him to command people to wear sandals. It was just how things were done in that culture, especially for the elite.
So the Bible reflects a patriarchal world where women's roles were limited. And while some texts offer complex portrayals or glimpses of equality, others reinforce those limits. And practices like polygamy were just part of the societal landscape, regulated but not necessarily divinely mandated for everyone or for restoration.
Yes, that seems to be a fair summary based on the texts. And trying to defend every single aspect of these ancient texts as literally true and ethically normative for today can force us into defending social structures and practices, patriarchy, slavery, certain forms of violence that are unacceptable by most modern ethical standards.
Okay, let's talk about hell. The popular image for many Christians, maybe fueled by art and literature like Dante's Inferno, is a fiery pit underground, ruled by Satan, with eternal conscious torment for the wicked. Is that picture actually found consistently in the Bible itself?
Not really, no. That popular, very vivid image is largely a later development, a synthesis of different ideas that evolved over time.
So what do the biblical terms refer to? Sheol. Hades, Gehenna.
Okay, let's break those down. Sheol is the main Hebrew term in the Old Testament. It basically just means the grave, the pit, the abode of all the dead righteous and wicked alike. It's a shadowy, neutral underworld, generally without clear notions of punishment or reward based on earthly life. It's just where dead people go.
Okay, so Sheol isn't really hell in the popular sense. What about Hades?
Hades is the Greek word used in the New Testament to translate Sheol, so it carries much of the same meaning, the realm of the dead. Sometimes in later Jewish thought and the NT, it starts to take on connotations of a waiting place, maybe with some differentiation, but it's still primarily the underworld.
And Gehenna, that sounds more fiery.
Gehenna is different. It refers to a specific geographical place, the Valley of Hinnom, just outside the walls of Jerusalem. In ancient times, it was associated with child sacrifice, and later it became essentially the city dump, where refuse and maybe even bodies of criminals were burned. So Jesus uses Gehenna metaphorically as a symbol of judgment, destruction, utter ruin, and rejection, like being thrown out with the trash to be burned up. It implies destruction, not necessarily endless conscious torture.
And Tartarus.
Tartarus appears only once, in 2 Peter, referring specifically to a place where rebellious angels are held in judgment. It draws on Greek mythology.
So none of these biblical terms directly map onto the popular image of eternal conscious torment in a fiery realm ruled by Satan.
Not directly or consistently, no. The pieces are there: fire, judgment, darkness, angels, the underworld. But the specific synthesis creating that very popular image comes later.
So where did the idea of eternal conscious torment really develop then?
That concept seems to have developed most explicitly during the Greco-Roman period, particularly in Jewish literature written between the Old and New Testaments, texts like the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha we mentioned earlier. Books like 1 Enoch have very graphic descriptions.
And Christianity picked up that thread.
It seems Christianity adopted and further developed those ideas, which were circulating in the Judaism of Jesus' day. Interestingly, Rabbinic Judaism, which developed after the destruction of the temple, largely moved away from those graphic eternal torment ideas, focusing more on concepts like Olam Haba, the world to come, and resurrection, often with more limited or corrective forms of post-mortem punishment.
So the common Christian image of eternal fiery torment is more a product of this historical and theological development, borrowing from intertestamental Jewish ideas rather than a clear, uniform teaching across the entire biblical text itself.
That's what the historical data strongly suggests, yes.
And for someone whose faith tradition heavily emphasizes that literal traditional image of hell as a core doctrine, understanding this historical development that it's not as clearly biblical as they might assume could be quite challenging, even faith-shaking.
It absolutely can be, because it shows that the traditional understanding might not be directly derived from the core biblical texts themselves, but from later interpretations, cultural influences, and selective readings. If someone's faith is primarily built on the tradition's explanation of the Bible, and that explanation is shown to perhaps misrepresent or oversimplify the original text, it can understandably cause a crisis.
Okay. What about the flip side? Ideas of resurrection and heaven. The plan of salvation concept, as understood in some traditions like the LDS model of pre-existence, spirit-body resurrection, progression through kingdoms to eventual heaven or godhood, is that specific framework clearly laid out in the New Testament or earliest Christianity?
You really don't find that specific, detailed framework clearly articulated in the New Testament, or even consistently in the earliest centuries of Christianity after the NT was written.
So what did the NT text say about the afterlife?
They actually present varied ideas about the kingdom of God. For instance, sometimes it's seen as a present earthly reality inaugurated by Jesus. Sometimes it's a future hope. Ideas about resurrection also vary. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about a transformed spiritual body, while the Gospels depict a more physical resurrection. Some texts emphasize an ascent to heaven, others a renewal of the earth.
So the modern popular plan of salvation taught in many churches, or the specific LDS framework, that's more of a later harmonization.
It often seems to be, yes. A harmonization of different threads found across various biblical texts, combined with later theological developments and interpretations specific to particular traditions. The specific LDS framework involving premortal existence, a distinct spirit world phase, universal bodily resurrection as a restoration of spirit and body, tiered heavens, and eternal progression towards godhood. That detailed sequence is not something you clearly find laid out in the New Testament or in the writings of the earliest church fathers.
Okay. Just briefly, though, putting aside the specifics of the afterlife, is there scholarly consensus that a historical Jesus actually existed?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The overwhelming scholarly consensus across diverse fields and viewpoints is that a man named Jesus of Nazareth existed in first-century Judea,
What do scholars generally agree on about him?
that he was likely an itinerant Jewish preacher and healer from Galilee, that he gathered followers, taught about the kingdom of God, clashed with some religious authorities, ran afoul of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, and was executed by crucifixion. And critically, from a historical perspective, stories about his resurrection began circulating very rapidly among his followers shortly after his death. That rapid emergence of resurrection belief is itself a historical phenomenon that requires explanation, regardless of how one explains it theologically.
Got it. Okay, our final specific topic, Revelation and End Times Prophecy. Many traditions interpret the book of Revelation as predicting specific events far in our future, connecting it to contemporary global headlines, political figures, things like that.
Yes, that's a very common way Revelation is read, especially in certain evangelical and Pentecostal circles, and it certainly influences some LDS interpretations too. But the academic consensus among biblical scholars who specialize in apocalyptic literature is quite different.
How so?
They would overwhelmingly argue that there are essentially no prophecies in the book of Revelation that predict specific events extending beyond the first century CE, which is when the book was most likely written.
So it was all about its time, not ours.
Exactly. Revelation was written primarily as an exhortation, a pastoral letter in apocalyptic disguise, to Christians facing persecution or the threat of persecution under the Roman Empire in its original context, probably late in the reign of Emperor Domitian, around 95 CE.
And the strange imagery, the beast, 666, the seals, trumpets, bowls.
It uses highly symbolic, often coded apocalyptic imagery that was common in Jewish literature of the time. It was meant to be meaningful and encouraging to that specific audience, referencing figures and events of their time. For example, the number 6666, using Hebrew gematria, where letters have numerical values, pretty clearly points to Nero Caesar. It was a critique of Roman imperial power and a call to faithfulness for Christians living under it.
But isn't apocalyptic imagery often deliberately ambiguous? Doesn't that ambiguity naturally lend itself to reinterpretation by later generations looking for relevance?
It absolutely does.
Okay.
That's precisely why it gets reinterpreted century after century. But doing so requires ignoring or downplaying the original historical context and the author's original purpose, and then forcing those ambiguous symbols onto later historical events or figures they were never intended to represent.
So every generation can find ways to make Revelation seem applicable to their own time.
Pretty much. People interpreted it during the Crusades, during the Reformation, during World Wars, and modern groups are constantly connecting it to current events like conflicts in the Middle East, technology, specific politicians. But this nearly always involves pulling the text away from its original first-century meaning and imposing a completely new one based on current anxieties.
Does the structure of Revelation support a clear timeline of future events?
Not really. The structure of Revelation is also notoriously complex and likely not strictly chronological. It seems to repeat cycles of judgment and hope using different sets of symbols, seals, trumpets, bowls, making attempts to map it onto a single linear future timeline very difficult and subjective.
And for traditions, particularly like the LDS Church, whose very name invokes the latter days or other strongly millennialist groups, these end times beliefs are often absolutely central to their identity and theology, aren't they?
Yes, they are often foundational. Belief in an imminent second coming, specific signs of the times of final great conflict. These are powerful motivators.
But the expert in our sources points out that interpretations based on misreading Revelation's original context can be problematic.
Yes. The concern raised is that these kinds of end times interpretations, when detached from context, are sometimes weaponized. They can be used for social control, for boundary policing. Are you watching for the signs? Are you one of the righteous remnant? Or even used to justify hostility towards certain groups identified as agents of the Antichrist, or obstacles to God's plan.
Instead of its original function.
Which was arguably more about offering hope, endurance, and a call to faithfulness for a specific community facing their own contemporary challenges and pressures from a powerful empire.
Wow. Okay. That is a truly deep dive. We have covered so much ground, challenging, I think, many common assumptions along the way about the Bible's origins, nature, and content.
We certainly have. And it really brings us back to what seems to be the core idea emerging from these sources. The Bible, like any complex collection of ancient texts, doesn't seem to possess a single, fixed, inherent meaning just waiting passively to be discovered.
Meaning isn't just in the text itself.
It seems its value and meaning are largely created, or at least activated, in how it is engaged with, how it is wielded, and by whom it is wielded. The text becomes meaningful through interpretation and application.
So the real question isn't just about the Bible as an ancient artifact, but how it's being used right now, today.
Exactly. Is it being used primarily to accumulate power, to control people, to justify prejudice? Or is it being used in a way that genuinely enriches lives, encourages compassion, promotes justice, and inspires positive values? That becomes the more critical ethical consideration, perhaps.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But it's also important to stress, despite all the academic challenges to traditional understandings, we've discussed the historical questions, the textual complexities, the ethical difficulties. It's also absolutely possible for individuals to find deep spiritual insight and profound moral value in their personal study of the Bible.
Even with all these questions.
Yes, when approached thoughtfully, honestly, and critically, maybe because it's approached that way, it can become what people need it to be for their own spiritual journey, their own relationship with the divine, their own search for meaning.
That's a really powerful thought to end on. So, okay, here's a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to perhaps mull over. As you reflect on this deep dive, how do you personally approach the Bible?
Yeah, what's your default mode?
Are you primarily looking for a literal history book and a straightforward rule book, maybe defending it against any perceived challenges? Or are you perhaps open to wrestling with it as a complex, layered, sometimes contradictory collection of ancient human texts?
Texts that reflect millennia of human struggles, diverse viewpoints, ancient contexts.
Seeing it maybe less as a perfect answer book and more as an invitation to deepen your understanding, to challenge your own assumptions, and perhaps even to reshape your faith in unexpected, maybe even richer ways.
Because engaging with it critically, wrestling with the hard parts, doesn't have to diminish faith. For many, it can actually lead to a more mature, resilient, and ultimately more meaningful understanding.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. It has been a truly fascinating and I think really important exploration.